Now, when I say a digital archive, what I mean is a comprehensive catalog of your objects of study, that is, texts, that is accessible from a computer both for our ease of access in personal research and for sharing. Most often, this is going to be accomplished through a database, which for a lot of different people can mean a bunch of different things. But in our context, as we are crummy, beaten down entire humanities researchers with little understanding of data science, it's just going to mean a well-organized set of files in a coherent structure. Now that sounds easier said than done because we all dream of being better organized when the reality is that our downloads folders all end up looking like this due to us being too lazy to actually put the important stuff where they belong. And that's in a lot of cases fine. Oftentimes the time you would spend on organizing your files into neat little folders could be better spent on research and deadlines. And after all, if you do end up losing track of your files, you can always download them again. Oh, but there it is. Wherever you got that material from, it was probably from a digital database or a digital archive like JSTOR. As scholars in the 21st century, we use these kinds of digital databases every day, not just JSTOR, but Google Scholar, MLA International Bibliography. Our university libraries are comprised of databases, whether they be of digital archives or physical copies that are indexed through listings in digital databases. If you've ever gone from writing a paper where you could just copy paste your quotes from a file from Project Gutenberg to actually having to hold in your hands like several different books and then type it out, you understand the value of having a digital archive. It not only makes our lives easier and the text much more accessible and affordable, but it straight up enables research in ways that we would have found impossible otherwise, whether it be because the physical texts are not available to us or we're engaging with digital humanities and corpus linguistic analysis tools that require digital copies of the original text. But let's say you want to do all this stuff, but your object of study is a text that hasn't really been written about so often and you can't find it on a database. Maybe all you can find is a library somewhere across the world having one copy that looks like this. That's why, as your scope of research starts to expand into the mid-2020s, you might find that the first step of your projects is often to create this kind of database yourself, not just for your convenience, but for expanding the scope of research for others that may be interested but may not have the same sort of access to the object of study. This was the case for my co-authors in my research project on Korean translations on Harlem Renaissance poetry, which was recently published in Studies in Modern British and American Poetry. So today I thought I would showcase a relatively easy way of making a robust yet accessible archive for studying texts with very little knowledge of code or computers required. There are different kinds of databases, each of them with their own benefits. Resources like the Internet Archive or Project Gutenberg host downloadable copies of a text wholesale, oftentimes in different file formats for compatibility reasons. Websites like the Perseus Digital Library at Tufts or Columbia's Digital Dante are research environments where you can read the base text alongside auxiliary materials like commentaries and different translations, leading to a reading experience that might be more productive. Oftentimes a digital database doesn't contain the text at all, but rather an index of objects that can be found elsewhere in other databases, compiled in a neat and tidy and easy to navigate way, like your library website, for example. When we are making our small archive as robust as possible, it's important to keep each of these pros in mind. We want to create an archive that maximizes compatibility and makes our objects of study accessible and is a good research environment. Creating an archive for accessibility means that as we collect our materials from different places based on our research interests, we want to organize them in a neatly packaged way that is internally consistent and easy to index and search. As we gather materials for our research, we may run into different kinds of resources in completely different places, but altogether relevant to our single interests. Our goal in creating a digital archive is to make an environment where all the relevant materials are viewable at the same time together so that we can search through this grouped up set of materials and do whatever we want with them that we would like in a way that is productive to our specific research goal. If our intent is not only to create an archive for personal research, but also for browsing on the go and sharing with others, and potentially working with data science tools like R or ANCONC, file compatibility is another important thing to consider. As researchers, you might use Word, OpenOffice, HWP, or whatever else that you prefer. The problem is that a lot of these programs use different kinds of file structures that are oftentimes proprietary, so opening them with each other will oftentimes result in a clunky file or often not work at all. Data viz tools like ANCONC also often have a hard time with these kinds of proprietary or specialized formats. Websites like Project Gutenberg solve this problem of compatibility by hosting a lot of different file formats per listing, but doing that is not only tedious, but also not necessary for our purposes. What we can do instead is to use a basic txt file which everyone, both people, computers, and ants, can read. The downside is that at the cost of compatibility, txt files don't have formatting, like italics, colors, or bold. This is because hidden underneath these style changes are lines of code, which are oftentimes different from format to format. This is also why our little ant friend has such difficulty parsing files that have this kind of stylized and specialized file structure rather than plain text, because the ant gets confused with all these like syntax words that are used by HTML rather than the actual text itself. But luckily for the ant and luckily for us, there is a workaround. TXT files do not have formatting, but we can use a markdown syntax, which is a simplified version of the HTML syntax we see here that is much more legible both to computers and people because it doesn't tend to interrupt the words that are inside the actual text itself. While if you are writing Markdown from scratch, there is a bit of a learning curve to learn the syntax because you have to type it out. There are Markdown editors out there with robust features that are oftentimes indistinguishable from traditional document editors like Word. And thus brings us to our last aspiration, which is to create a productive research environment. When you're doing your research, you have so many Chrome tabs open, you switch back and forth between them and the book you're holding in your lap, and then you have to consult the ant, and then you open your Word file, and then you switch back and forth between all these screens, and it can get so confusing. To have an archive that is also at the same time a nice, quaint research environment where you can cross-reference different texts within the same environment, and also consult auxiliary materials side to side with the original text that you're studying is a great way to have a reading environment and a research environment that naturally fosters different potentialities in your research. For example, take Digital Dante here, where the original Italian text is placed side to side with the two prominent translations of Dante's Inferno. You can switch between viewing the Mundbaum translation and the Longfellow translation side to side, or the original poem, and you can also consult auxiliary materials like commentaries in your research process, all from within the site environment itself. Now, at first, being able to create an archive that is accessible, compatible, and is a productive research environment without knowledge in coding or otherwise data science or software might seem like a lot to ask, but fear not, since what ticks all these boxes are not some kind of technologically intensive and specialized piece of software for archive creation, but some of the most popular note-taking apps out there. Notion, Obsidian, and Logseq are all Markdown-based note-taking apps designed for personal everyday use, such as diary writing or journaling, each with a lot of special features including data visualization capabilities, online publishing, collaborative note-taking, etc. But the most important of these features that all of these have for our purposes is the humble wiki link, which is a clickable link from a note that opens another note from inside the same file structure. This simple feature allows us to make an archive that is fully transversable, going from one text to its author to the publication it was featured in and to and fro. In these note-taking apps, wiki links are something we can make just as easily as typing 2 brackets, but they are powerful enough to create a holistic research environment where texts are connected through relevance from any point of view and can be observed and read side by side. It might sound a lot more complicated than it is, so I will be doing a demonstration with my personal favorite of these 3, which is Obsidian. So here we have the archive that I created for translations of Harlem Renaissance poetry during the Japanese occupation of Korea. We see that we have English texts here, Korean texts here. These are all poems that, were written in English and then translated to Korean, and I've taken the liberty of making short entries on the publications and translators involved that come between Korean text and the English text. Once you understand how to use wiki text, just by mentioning something else within 2 brackets. The formulation of these was pretty intuitive. Here we have just a short bio of whatever is being described in the entry. We have a catalog of texts that are published in this publication, some auxiliary materials that might help contextualize this publication within the entire history. But you can see that you can click through these texts and go to the translated text that you wanted to go to, and you can click back to the publication and things like that. And just every time you formulate one of these mutually linked relationships, Obsidian will remember, and we'll get to that later. But aside from the original texts themselves, I've just attached links for convenience to the original text, and then the translation, the publication, and of course the source. I believe this is from Korean History Database, so this required minimal editing because Korean History Database has texts all OCR'd and digitized. But some of these poems, some of these translations are only, I believe, available through, this one isn't even available as a scan. We had to go and look at it ourselves. A lot of these are hand transcribed as a result. I believe if you have a competent OCR software available, that might help speed up the process a lot more. Besides the process of gathering the materials, it's not really so difficult to formulate an entry that enables you to mutually seek different entries. And I think this presents a lot of opportunities for research. Like, for example, if you hover above a link to an entry, you can quickly preview what's inside. You can open it at the same time, so you can compare the original text to the translation. You can also conduct comparative study between different translations through this feature. Of course, the stylistic differences, things like use of different words to translate one original word. I think this opens up a lot of research potential as an archive of translation. And I think if you were browsing these texts in their original environments, like for example the National Museum and also the online Korean History Database, it wouldn't be so easy to view them comparatively. And I think digitization and forming a small digital archive enables a lot of research methods might not have been so accessible before. I think this is a methodology that is very worth it for the time investment. And beyond just that, as I mentioned before, every time you sort of define a connection between one object of study, whether that be poem, translation, translator, publication, original poet, and another, Obsidian remembers that relationship, and you can view that relationship through the graph view function. Each of these little nodes and circles are an entry, and I've marked what kind of entry they are by color here using the tag system, which you just enter. You would just enter hashtag something at the bottom here to sort of determine what type of entry it is. And you can see that each of the circles their sizes are contingent on how many connections they have, how many times they are mentioned. You can see that Claude McKay was translated and published in 5 different publications by 3 different translators that we could track down. You can see that Dongguang had a significant amount of translations, and only by Hanhuku. And I think considering that this is a holistic archive of Harlem Renaissance poems in occupation Korea, we can see how much influence each of these actors, each of these objects of study had over the environment of that specific textual landscape, just from parsing the size of these circles and the connections that are made between these circles. And of course you can click through and view the entries for each of them from the graph view. And of course you can fiddle around with, you know, the display options to make them a little more presentable, or just be able to navigate it in a more specific way. And I think based on what kind of contextual landscape that you're studying, the implication of the motion when you drag each text around is going to be different. I believe County Cullen is at the center here because of the amount of publications that he was translated in. I believe Logsec has a similar graph view that might be even more robust, but I think what I appreciate the most about Obsidian specifically is the amount of community built plugins. So there are ease of use features like using 2 dashes to create an end dash, an editing toolbar for if you're unfamiliar with Markdown syntax. This makes it a lot easier and makes it a lot more like a traditional word processor. But there's also things that are more specifically helpful for archival. So for example, it integrates with Pandoc, which is a tool that sort of natively translates the Markdown syntax into things like Word documents, PDF, and things like that. If you copied and pasted this from here to Word, I think if you're in the reader menu, I think it does translate fairly well. But I think if you have an archive set up and you want to share with someone else just the text within the archive rather than the full archive itself, this is a fairly compatible way to do it. There's also a data viz tool that I appreciated a lot called Charts View, where in this one, let's change this path to / to deal with the entire archive, add enable search interaction, and it'll create a word cloud for you based on the frequency of each word that appears in all the text and all the entries here. You can, as you saw before, you can specify which folder this indexes, and this serves as a fairly good preliminary parsing of if you're interested in corpus linguistics or just what to study within the archive. Unfortunately, it doesn't really help with the current my current project, so I haven't created the exceptions that I would need to. Like for example, HTTPS is mentioned a lot, but that shouldn't really be considered. The 3 dashes are just artifacts. But yeah, there's a lot of research potential that is enabled by this kind of program, which is nice because a lot of us as humanities scholars, we're not really sort of technologically inclined. I personally have very little experience with software or coding or data science and data viz and all that, but I think this was fairly easy to pick up because this is at its core an application just for taking notes that anybody can use. The fact that you're able to use this simple program to create a library of text that might have otherwise flown under the radar or eventually lost or otherwise just inaccessible to study comparatively with one another, or to study in this kind of context where the archival environment is pretty tidy and sensible, and everything is streamlined enough to cater to your personal research interests or specific textual context. I think that poses a lot of research potential, even though it is not a specialized software. It doesn't really take much technical skill in order to use it in this way. I think I was able to produce a fairly insightful result. This graph is very insightful. This word cloud is also very insightful. And even though perhaps I might take what I glean from these visualizations and move them to more specialized software like Nconc or R with Stylo integration, I think the fact that this simple day-to-day utility that I use for other purposes and that other people use for just general use, using our day-to-day stuff for our research and making that productive enough for our research to be opened up and interesting in new ways, I think that's what's very important and beautiful about digital humanities. Using our digital life and integrating it with our research process so that we can make it accessible to ourselves and to other people. I think that kind of accessibility is very valuable in what digital humanities is all about.